On April 20th, 2018, the news broke in a way that felt almost disconnected from reality, as if it didn't belong to the same world that had been playing his music just hours earlier. Avicii, one of the most influential DJs of his generation, had been found dead in Muscat, Oman. The statement released to the public was brief, almost sterile, delivered in a tone that made it sound like just another headline passing through the endless cycle of information. But for millions of people around the world, it didn't register as news. It registered as something much heavier, something that didn't make sense, because there had been no visible collapse leading up to this moment, no slow unraveling that prepared the audience for an ending. There was no farewell tour, no final performance framed as a goodbye, no public acknowledgement that anything was reaching a breaking point. Avicii was still present in the world, still played, still celebrated, still associated with energy and life. And yet, somewhere far away from the stages that defined him, in a place stripped of lights and noise, everything had already come to an end long before anyone realized it was even possible. The reaction that followed wasn't just shock, but a kind of collective confusion that spread just as quickly as the news itself. Social media filled with messages that felt incomplete, sentences that trailed off, thoughts that didn't fully form, as if people were trying to grasp something they couldn't quite reach. Fellow artists, many of whom had stood beside him on the same stages, struggled to explain how someone who embodied movement, sound, and connection could suddenly disappear without warning. Fans returned to his music not only to remember him, but to search for answers hidden within the melodies, replaying tracks that once felt uplifting but now carried a different weight. Because the image the world had of Avicii was built entirely on light. Bright progressions, euphoric drops, moments designed to lift people out of themselves and into something larger. But behind that image, there had always been another version of him, one that didn't exist in front of the crowd, one that couldn't be translated into sound. And as the noise of the world reacted louder and louder to his death, that quieter reality began to surface, revealing that the ending was not as sudden as it appeared. It only felt that way because no one had been looking in the right place, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late to change anything. Before the name Avicii carried any meaning to the outside world, he was simply Tim Bergling, growing up in Stockholm in a life that, on the surface, looked quiet and ordinary. There were no signs of spectacle, no early exposure to massive stages, no environment that naturally pushed him toward becoming a global figure. Instead, his world was relatively contained, shaped by routine, by family, and by a personality that leaned inward rather than outward. Tim was not naturally drawn to attention. He was reserved, introspective, and often more comfortable observing than participating. While other people sought connection through presence, he seemed to find it through distance. But within that quietness, there was already a sensitivity forming, something subtle but important. He responded deeply to sound, to emotion, to atmosphere, as if he was constantly processing things at a level that didn't need to be spoken. It wasn't obvious at the time, but this internal world would later become the foundation for everything he created. As he moved into his teenage years, that internal space began to take a more defined shape through music. Without formal training or a traditional path, Tim started experimenting on his own, teaching himself how to produce tracks using a computer, building sounds layer by layer in a controlled and solitary environment. This process suited him perfectly. It allowed him to stay within his comfort zone while still expressing something that felt larger than himself. There was no audience yet, no pressure, no expectation, just the act of creating and refining something until it felt right. But even in this early stage, a quiet contradiction had already begun to take form. The more he withdrew into his private creative world, the more his music seemed to reach outward, connecting with people beyond his immediate reality. What started as something deeply personal was slowly becoming something public, something that would eventually pull him into a life that demanded visibility, performance, and constant engagement. And without fully realizing it, Tim was already stepping onto a path that would require him to become someone very different from who he naturally was, a shift that would only grow more difficult to sustain over time. The transition from Tim Bergling to Avicii did not happen slowly or in a way that allowed him time to adjust. It accelerated almost immediately, driven by the rapid spread of his music across the internet and into the global mainstream. What began as something personal, something created in isolation, quickly turned into something that no longer belonged only to him. Tracks like Levels were not just successful releases, they became defining moments in electronic music, reshaping the expectations of what the genre could be and pushing his name into a level of visibility that demanded more than just production. His music moved beyond private listening and into massive shared experiences, filling festivals, clubs, and public spaces where thousands of people gathered to feel something together. And with that shift came a transformation that was not optional. Tim, who had once been comfortable behind a screen, was now expected to stand in front of crowds, to perform, to engage, and to represent the energy his music created. The name Avicii became more than an identity. It became a symbol, something people projected their emotions onto, associating it with freedom, release, and a sense of escape. But as that symbol grew stronger and more widely recognized, it also began to separate itself from the person behind it, creating a distance that was subtle at first, but steadily increasing. At the height of his success, everything appeared perfectly aligned from the outside, almost too perfect to question. His presence dominated festival lineups, his sets attracted massive audiences, and his music became a universal language that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries. Every performance followed a structure that felt both familiar and powerful, building tension and releasing it in moments that created a shared emotional high among thousands of people at once. The crowd responded in unison, moving and reacting as if connected by something larger than themselves, reinforcing the image of control and mastery that surrounded him. But beneath that surface, a different reality was taking shape, one that did not follow the same rhythm as the music. The demands of constant touring created a cycle that repeated endlessly, cities blending into each other, time zones collapsing into a continuous stream of movement without pause. For someone who was never naturally comfortable in environments of constant attention, this level of exposure began to introduce a kind of strain that was not immediately visible. What appeared as confidence on stage was often something closer to necessity, something that had to be maintained regardless of how he actually felt. The connection with the audience, once genuine and energizing, slowly began to shift into something more complicated, something that felt like obligation. And while the world continued to see Avicii as a source of life, energy, and escape, the person behind that image was already beginning to experience the cost of sustaining it. A cost that was growing quietly beneath the surface, becoming heavier with each performance, each expectation, and each moment that required him to be someone he was not naturally meant to be. The first signs did not appear as something dramatic or immediately alarming, at least not to the outside world. They showed up quietly, almost blending into the lifestyle that surrounded him. The constant touring, the endless cycle of performances, the pressure to maintain a certain level of output, all of it could easily be mistaken for part of the job. But over time, the strain began to surface in ways that were harder to ignore. Physically, his body started to respond to the pace he was being forced to keep. Health issues began to emerge, linked not just to exhaustion, but to a system that had no real pause built into it. Mentally, the environment he was placed in began to conflict more and more with who he naturally was. The crowds, the expectations, the constant visibility. These were not things he had ever been comfortable with, yet they had become unavoidable. What once felt manageable began to feel overwhelming, and what once felt like an opportunity started to resemble something closer to a trap. Even as his success continued to grow, the gap between the public image and his internal state widened further. There were moments when he tried to step back, moments when he attempted to regain control over the direction his life was taking. But the momentum of everything around him made it difficult to slow down. The system he had become part of did not easily allow for hesitation, and every attempt to reduce the pressure seemed to come with new expectations attached. From the outside, it still looked like a life defined by success. From the inside, it was becoming something much harder to sustain. As time went on, the situation moved beyond strain and into something more serious, something that could no longer be contained within the idea of pressure alone. The attempts to cope became more visible, and the effects of that coping began to take a toll on both his health and his stability. The lifestyle that surrounded him offered temporary relief, but it also introduced new complications that only deepened the problem. What had once been an imbalance was now turning into a cycle, one that repeated itself without clear resolution. Even after stepping away from touring, even after making the decision to distance himself from the environment that had contributed to the problem, the impact did not simply disappear. The absence of the stage did not immediately restore what had already been affected. Instead, it revealed how much had been carried beneath the surface for so long. There were fewer distractions now, fewer external demands, but also fewer barriers between him and the reality he had been trying to manage. The silence that replaced the noise did not bring clarity in the way people might expect. It created space, but it also created exposure, leaving him alone with everything that had been building over time. And in that space, without the structure that had once defined his life, the weight of everything became more difficult to navigate. By the time the world began to recognize that something was seriously wrong, it was no longer a question of pressure or recovery. It had already moved into a place where the path forward was unclear, where the systems that had once supported him no longer functioned in the same way, and where the distance between who he was and what he had been expected to be had become too great to reconcile. In the days that followed his death, the noise of the world did not disappear, but it changed. The initial shock slowly settled into something quieter, something heavier, as people began to process what had actually been lost. Tributes appeared across every platform, from fellow artists who had shared stages with him to fans who had never met him but felt as if they had known him through his music. His songs returned to the charts, streaming numbers surged, and playlists filled again with tracks that once represented energy, movement, and connection. But now, those same songs carried a different weight. They no longer felt like simple moments of escape. They felt like echoes, reminders of someone who had once stood behind those sounds but was no longer there. Memorials formed in cities around the world, some large, some small, candles placed side by side, creating quiet spaces where people gathered not just to mourn, but to feel something together one more time. It became increasingly clear that Avicii had created more than music. He had created experiences that people had attached to their own lives, moments that existed beyond the tracks themselves. And in his absence, those moments remained, but they were changed, shaped by the awareness that the person behind them was gone. As time moved forward, the conversation around his life began to shift from reaction to reflection. Discussions about mental health, pressure, and the hidden cost of success became more prominent, with his story often placed at the center of those conversations. But even within those attempts to understand, there remained a sense that something essential could not be fully explained. Because beyond the public narrative, there was still the individual experience, the internal reality that no one else had direct access to. His legacy then became layered in a way that extended beyond his music. On one level, it was the sound he helped define, the way he reshaped electronic music and brought it into a more emotional, accessible space. On another level, it was the reminder of how easily perception can diverge from reality, how the image presented to the world can exist separately from what is actually lived beneath it. And perhaps that is where the weight of his story truly remains, not just in what he created, but in what could not be seen while he was creating it. The songs continue to play, the crowds continue to move, and the moments he helped build continue to exist in the lives of others. But the person at the center of it all is no longer there. And what remains is not just absence, but a quiet awareness of everything that existed beneath the surface, everything that was never fully visible, and everything that can only be understood after it is already gone.